Now, I know I've told you about Mike O'Brien before. He's the guy that runs all of product for Hyundai in the Americas, and he is absolutely one of us. He's got a couple of cool cars, he's got not one but two airplanes, you could definitely say that I'm jealous, and he's a numbers guy. So he and I sit down over lunch yesterday, and this is after I'd done all my research about the horsepower and the torque and the wheelbase, and he says to me that this segment, the subcompact crossover segment, this is the new wild, wild west in the car world. I'm looking at him at this point, I'm thinking to myself, he's probably been sucking on too much avgas because this is anything but the wild, wild west. This is for people like, young families on a budget or pensioners that are just cheapskates. They buy things like this. Well, he pulls out a spreadsheet of like the mid-size crossover segment, things like the Rogue, and he shows me all of the data, the numbers, the dimensions like the wheelbase. And every time you and I have looked at cars like that, and we've looked at a lot of Rogues, it's like 106.4 is the wheelbase of the Rogue, but its nearest competitor like the RAV4 is 106.2, and even a GLC is 106.5. They're all within like a tenth of an inch or millimeters of each other because they're all copying each other, a mature segment. Then he shows me this spreadsheet on this segment, and it's anything but. There's a swing in wheelbase of like 5 inches, cubic feet of like up to 6 cubic feet difference. Even the rear leg room, it's like one's a limousine and one practically amputates your legs. So while I wouldn't go so far as to saying this is the wild, wild west that Mr. O'Brien thinks it is, I will say you and I are going to drive a very new segment in about as west as you could get in the US without going east. Hazardous driving conditions, use extreme caution. One-lane road. I cannot think of a more perfect road to test out a small crossover than a road that needs hazardous condition signs. Now, you and I have been here before, but we drove something with almost 400 horsepower that was magnificent, and we did make it fly. That was the Porsche Boxster Spyder, and the weather was much better then. But when in Rome, let's do it as Romans. We're also going to be driving on a lava field. And this does give us some things that we'd have in real towns, which is elevation changes, some tight roads, something that's perfect for a small vehicle. So with that, let's slow down a little bit here. We got a nice little hill. Let's put our foot into it and see what we do with 195 pounds of torque. Wind up a little bit. That's just in regular mode. Now, you and I have driven this engine before, and let's not get some air on this one because something tells me it wouldn't end very well. But you and I have driven this engine before with 195 pounds of torque in a big Sonata, in Elantras, and here it works just fine, especially on a road like this where we have all these elevation changes. And this engine is one of my favorites in the Hyundai group, and I'd say it's very well matched to this vehicle. We've been driving it in and around Kona here, even up on beautiful Saddle Road, and there was plenty of passing power. Okay, that's the basic mode. Let's get to the crest of this hill and let's try the sport mode, which, if I'm honest, all it does is change the throttle mapping and the transmission tuning. So let's go around this turn here. Actually, you know what, not too fast here. Now let's put our foot into it. It doesn't make that much of a difference. Let's just say it works. 195 pounds of torque definitely works in this little thing. Because what we talked about in the tech review, it only weighs anywhere between 2,800 and 3,200 pounds. So almost 200 pounds of torque matched against that kind of weight, that's better than a small crossover should be.
Typical CUV proportions throw the power at the corners. This means the feet or the wheels are way out at the corners with short rear overhang, short front overhang. This one's a little bit atypical. We've thrown a little bit of the weight forward of the front wheel, giving it a slightly longer front overhang. This presented itself as kind of a challenge to the design team. What do we do with all this mass up here? Well, we tried to turn a negative into a positive by bringing a kind of presence to the overall design. This also consequently provides another kind of a challenge with regard to the structure of the car. The bumper beam is down in this area, and typically what happens is it brings the plan view of the car out here. So what we did was we stood the grille up, giving it a formal presence and an assertive kind of a quality, and then we brought in this really unique wheel spat and headlight housing area here. So the headlight's actually down here, and the DRL array is up here with the turn signal, giving it a really modern, protective kind of a look.
Okay, so let's stay in sport mode. And the road, I wouldn't really call it straight, but the elevation changes are a bit more back here. We can get a little bit more speed. And the thing we really understand here is there's some good high-speed stability, and there's a very specific reason for that. The rear suspension on this one is related to the Elantra Sport. So what's going on here is all-wheel drive gets a fully independent Albert Bierman approved rear suspension that is a multi-link unit. If this was just the regular 2-liter model, it would have a crappy torsion beam. We're not driving that today, and if I'm honest, we're probably not going to drive that model. But even if we were, a torsion beam wouldn't be able to take these elevation changes, especially at the speeds I'm going. And please don't try this at home. It's fun, but you don't want to go off into a lava field there. And this is where, if you've driven these things before, and we drove, the CX-3, which arguably is one of the better driving of the bunch of these small crossovers. If you guys remember, that CX-3 has a very fancy and complex rear suspension, which is the reason why that vehicle is much more expensive than its competitors. I would argue Coleman's racing habit has something to do with that, but don't tell them I told you so. But overall, they're trying to do the same thing but different here by segmenting it out, having the crappy rear suspension, there's really no nice way to say it, for people who want a price, and then a suspension that can do this for people like you and I. That it's admirable. You don't see many car companies doing that. And here, the overall, where the rubber meets the road, it works. Notice this road, this is not something you're normally going to take a vehicle like this on. There's still a lot of composure as you get some air. Please don't try that at home, but it's still so much fun. If you remember the Porsche episode, we got a lot more air than that. And then the other thing that's interesting is there isn't a significant amount of pitch, squat, dive, and roll. And notice I'm pushing this thing much harder than most people who would buy one of these things, which I find interesting because it makes something you don't expect when you're buying a small crossover is quality of ride. And by investing money into the rear suspension, there is a quality of ride. Then combined with something that you and I talked about previously in many other episodes featuring this specific engine, this has the transmission that Hyundai makes. And I would argue they do that, it's not like the Steel where it saves the money. They're able to design and build their own tolerances of the transmission, and it works better with their own engine. So here I'm able to drive a vehicle that is designed for taking the Rugrats, really small, young Rugrats, to school, and actually have some fun with it. So the quality of ride is not just that Albert Bierman thing in the back, it's the suspension and the transmission and the engine all working in conjunction in a vehicle, and it kind of exceeds the segment, if you will. And granted, does it exceed that CX-3? Probably not, but better than expected. And now for something completely different that really has nothing to do with the car, but it does because it's a Kona. We're drove in Kona, so we had to do something Kona. But we need to file this under the heading of, this is significantly embarrassing for me. With that, here you go.
3, 2, 1.
See you, sucker.
You started early!
Okay, that was a bit much though. And with that, don't say I never gave you anything.
Plenty of headroom, baby.
Well, that's kind of the reason why we're doing this here, to prove a point.
Okay.
And it's sometimes
we're both 6-footers, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's go over a couple things. Does
All
it
right.
fit? I moved the seat up to allow room for the camera, but does it work back there for you?
I'm perfect. I've got it. I can cross my legs. I could.
Can you do this?
I could go man style.
Sort of.
Actually, my butt.
Yeah, sit up. Okay.
My butt is.
Yeah, your wife wouldn't want you slouching.
Well,
like
I'm
that.
always slouching anyway.
So it works. I don't know
think
what
so.
it is about the viewers. They seem to like to see me in the back seat of these cars, so it's a new thing I've been doing. So I figured if I have to do it, you
Okay.
have to do it.
Well, as long as you make me look 10 pounds lighter, I'll be all right.
Well, especially now that you can become a grandparent. I think everybody
Now everybody knows.
Yeah, everybody
Thanks a lot.
knows. So Does this mean now that you're going to be designing more practical cars?
No.
No.
I've already done that job. That's the ultimate design project. So I've already fathered two. Now it's grandfather time is somebody else's job.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
Time, midlife crisis time. It's really one of those things where the car is lifeless for a really long time because we're following engineering criteria and package criteria. So it's really Geppetto sort of carving away at a wooden doll. But until that moment of inspiration of trying to figure out things like stance and attitude and personality, stance especially, the car is really without a soul.
So what makes a car lifeless or doesn't have a soul?
You can get within the design process, you can get pretty staid and repetitive with regard to what you're doing at any given phase of the project, whether it's sketching, whether it's clay or anything like that. And my job as a design chief is to make sure that we're constantly being reminded of what the big picture is, what the theme is, what we're going after. The other aspect of car design too is that you could be sketching and wrestling this thing to the ground for the longest time, but there comes a point in time where it's role reversal, where you have to start listening with your eyes. You have to start understanding, okay, now what is the car trying to tell me? Instead of you're applying action to the design now, the clay model that is, it's now about time for you to kind of listen and say, okay, what's natural? Where should things lie? How should lines be? Are things too tall? Is it too stiff or whatever? And you start absorbing that osmosis or whatever, and then you start changing your ways. It's not about this forceful reckoning that you have every day as an interaction with the car trying to get the design out. Now it's more about, okay, I've gotten it this far, now let me see what it wants to be.
Okay, so let's make this incredibly simple. I like this. I like it a lot, more so than I thought it would going into it. And here's why. Remember that driving dynamic spectrum that we talk about in many Mazda and Hyundai and Kia episodes, where Mazda CX-3s and Mazda 3s are always up here, and Hyundais and Kias usually are down here. But then we started with that Elantra GT, and it moved way up here. I would argue the Kona is actually a little bit closer to the CX-3 in this case, because it's not simply purely driving dynamics in this segment. It's driving dynamics in how it works with packaging and how it works with what kind of toys can be put in a vehicle like this and at what cost. Like, for example, I think the CHR is a damn good looking vehicle, but it's so basic. You can't get anything in it. This, you can get a sunroof, a head-up display, fancy stereo system, but also things like keeping you in the lane, stuff that I never tell you about because I like to focus on driving dynamics. Well, here, all of that kind of comes together and it makes it a better package. But like that X2, money. The one we drove is almost 30 grand. And I'm gonna leave you with a question here. Is that too much money, too little money, or kind of just right? Or is this the kind of thing where you don't go crazy on the options, you go with the basic one below 20 grand and call it a day? Let me know which one you would choose, why you would choose it, the cheap one or the fancy one, and what region of the world you hail from. And you know what current, prudent car do you drive? Let me know in the comments below or via our social media, MotoManTV all one word, MotoManTV all one word, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And with that, huge thank you to Chris Chapman for being my first ever guest of an interview in the back seat of a super small car. I guess that was the first on the show. So I'll see you next time. Be safe.